The crawler was sealed for geological work. That is the whole of my survival, a door I had latched from the inside at 0340 hours to prevent sample contamination during an extended core extraction, a door I did not open again until I had met my extraction window 14 hours later. I did not know that while I was 7 meters underground with my instruments and my seal intact, the world above me was finishing its dying. I know it now. I have had 4 years to know it with considerable precision. My name is Davin Hesh. I was a corporal in the 3rd Outer Perimeter Survey Element, Heron's Drift Detachment, at the time of Protocol Ardenne. I am the only member of that detachment still alive. I am now a civilian contractor attached to the Settled Accounts Formation's Ground Assessment Teams, which is the role I will occupy for the remainder of my working life, however long that turns out to be. I was asked to write a full account of what I witnessed, beginning on Heron's Drift and ending on the surface of Kalendi Reach's administrative capital, and that is what I am doing. I will write it the way a surveyor writes, precisely in sequence without ornament. I will begin with the door. The Ardenne Gap was not a gap in any defensive sense when it was created. It was a formal negotiated passage, a humanitarian trans-corridor 16 light minutes wide, running through the outer shell of Earth's perimeter defense line at coordinates that had been jointly surveyed and agreed upon under the compact of Muriel's hand. The compact was 18 years old. The Kalendi Reach had been parties to it for 16 of those years, joining as associate signatories after a period of what our diplomatic corps described as productive alignment. They were not a member species in the Colonial Assembly, but they were considered adjacent to membership, close enough that the word ally appeared in public briefings without quotation marks, and close enough that we had agreed, in the 12th revision of the compact, to extend the humanitarian corridor provisions to Kalendi-flagged vessels transiting toward and away from the outer colony networks. That revision was called the Ardenne Amendment. It created the Ardenne Gap. The name was proposed by the Kalendi delegation and accepted without particular thought, because we were not in the habit of scrutinizing the nomenclature our partners suggested for minor logistical provisions. The Kalendi word that was translated as Ardenne means, in their primary administrative dialect, an opening left unguarded. We did not know this at the time. A great many things we did not know at the time have since been assembled into a record that I have read in its entirety, because the people who assembled it thought it important that I should read it, and I agreed with them. I will tell you what is relevant. The Ardenne Gap had been used for ordinary transit for 6 years before Protocol Ardenne. Kalendi medical supply ships, refugee transports, survey vessels, and diplomatic couriers moved through it on a recorded schedule. Our perimeter defense units tracked them as a matter of procedure, but did not board them. The compact's inspection waiver provisions covered Kalendi-flagged humanitarian vessels, and we had never found a reason to challenge that. The traffic was consistent, benign, and boring in the way that 6 years of boring traffic tends to make a thing look permanent and safe. The traffic had also been deliberately managed. This is something the post-Ardenne investigation established with considerable thoroughness. The Kalendi Reach's Directorate of External Security had run a 12-year program of what they called, in internal documents later recovered, corridor conditioning, the deliberate cultivation of a transit pattern through the Ardenne Gap that would be so routine and so unvarying and so demonstrably harmless that the colonial defense units monitoring it would develop exactly the habits of attention that they developed. The 6 years of boring traffic was not incidental. It was the plan. They needed our perimeter defense personnel to find the gap boring. They needed us to treat Kalendi-flagged humanitarian vessels the way you treat furniture in a room you have occupied for a long time, as objects whose position and character you have stopped actively evaluating, because nothing about them has ever given you a reason to. They were very good at this. I say so without admiration and without particular anger. It is simply an accurate characterization of a thing they accomplished. They built the boring traffic with the same precision that they built the VETH-9 modification program, and they ran both programs concurrently for 11 years, and neither one showed in anything we were watching. I think often about the people in the Kalendi Reach's Directorate of External Security who managed both programs simultaneously. I think about the administrative meetings at which these two tracks were reviewed and updated and coordinated. I think about the meeting at which someone determined that the conditioning was sufficient and the delivery was ready, and the execution date should be set. I think about this not because it illuminates anything useful, but because it is the kind of thing that a person who has sat in a room with 12 empty chairs tends to think about in the absence of any way to stop. In the 43 days before Protocol Ardenne was executed, 17 additional Kalendi vessels were logged through the Ardenne Gap. Their manifest listed medical supplies, personnel transfers, and technical equipment for 3 outer ring Kalendi stations. They were Kalendi flagged. They had Kalendi crews. They passed through without incident, proceeded to their logged waypoints, and then, over a period of 9 hours on a day I will not describe with any precision, because to do so would suggest that this was an event with an aesthetic, a day that had a character, a weather, a quality, rather than what it was, which was an act of deliberate biological murder committed against 947,002 people who had not yet been killed. Those vessels released their actual cargo. Aerosolized Veth-9 is a pathogen engineered for human respiratory architecture. This is not a natural attribute of the compound. Veth-9 in its base form is a Kalendi industrial solvent derivative with mild toxicity to most carbon-based life. The version released over Heron's Drift, the Shoal of Calmette, Outer Pelun Station, and the Tillich reserves had been modified over a period that subsequent investigation placed at no fewer than 11 years to bond specifically with the alveolar tissue structure of the human lung. It did not affect Kalendi biology. It was not intended to. The engineering had one purpose, and the purpose had been planned for at minimum 11 years, which means that the Kalendi Reach was conducting this development concurrently with the period in which they joined the Compact of Morel's Hand as associate signatories and subsequently negotiated the Ardenne Amendment. They asked us to leave a door open. Then they spent 11 years building what they would walk through it. I did not know any of this on the day it happened. I knew that I was 7 meters underground in a sealed crawler, extracting core samples from a basaltic formation that the survey element had flagged for mineral assessment, and that the air in the crawler smelled of machine oil and cold metal, and the particular staleness that accumulates in a sealed environment after 14 hours of occupancy. I knew that I was ahead of extraction schedule, and that I would be back at the forward, operating base by 1700 hours if the final sample run proceeded without complication. The sample run proceeded without complication. I sealed the samples, logged the extraction, and opened the crawler's door at 1714 hours local. The first thing I noticed was that the air tasted wrong. Not toxic, I had no indication of toxicity and would not have, being outside the Veth-9 dispersal envelope. The crawler had come up at the edge of the surveyed zone, and the prevailing winds had carried the majority of the release north-northeast, toward the main population centers. What I tasted was something like burning particulate, the kind of mineral dust that gets into everything after an atmospheric disturbance. I did not immediately connect it to anything. I logged the air quality reading as anomalous and began packing for the drive back. The drive took 40 minutes. The forward operating base sat at the edge of Heron's Drift's secondary settlement ring, a cluster of prefabricated structures occupied by our 8-person survey detachment and a support staff of 4. 12 people in total. I had known all of them for between 8 months and 2.5 years. Senior Technical Specialist Aaron Mossad, who had been on the detachment for 11 months longer than I had, and who kept a small collection of mineral samples on her workstation shelf that she had gathered from every world she had ever surveyed, including 2 that I had also surveyed, and on which we had briefly overlapped before either of us knew the other. Corporal Denny Vass, who was 23 years old and who had recently begun studying for the engineering qualification exam during off shifts, and who had asked me twice to review practice problem sets with him, because he said my survey background meant I had useful intuitions about applied spatial reasoning. The others, each known to me in the particular way that people become known to one another over months in a small shared workspace, not intimately, not profoundly, but with a specific texture of familiarity that is different from not knowing someone and that cannot be recovered once it is gone. I pulled the crawler into the vehicle bay at 1756 hours and found the bay door open and the interior lights still on. This was not unusual in itself. The bay door was frequently left open during the day shift. The lights were on timers that did not discriminate between duty hours and off hours. I got out of the crawler, stretched my back, and walked across the bay toward the operations module. The first person I found was Technical Specialist Aaron Mossad, seated at her workstation with her forehead resting on the console, her right hand still on the keyboard, as if she had simply placed her head down to rest and had not lifted it again. The mineral sample collection was still on the shelf above her. I called her name. I touched her shoulder. I understood within approximately 4 seconds what had happened, and I stepped backward and stood for a moment in the center of the operations module, looking at the 12 workstations that occupied the room and counting the people I could see. I will not describe what I found in each part of the base in detail. I will say that I found everyone, that none of them had suffered in a prolonged way. The VETH9 cascade progressed rapidly once the alveolar bonding reached critical threshold, and that the last log entry in the operation system was a Colonial Assembly emergency broadcast that had begun transmitting at 1109 hours and had been received at 1112 hours, which gave the detachment approximately 4.5 hours after the warning before the progression concluded. The broadcast had come in, the warning had been heard. There was nothing that could have been done with it in that interval that would have saved anyone inside the dispersal envelope without a sealed environment to retreat into. I was the sealed environment. I spent the rest of that evening on the emergency channel, providing my location, my status, and the status of the forward operating base. I received confirmation at 2340 hours that emergency response teams were en route. I was told to remain sealed in the crawler and to avoid exterior contact. I already knew this. I sat in the crawler with the machine oil smell and the cold metal and the staleness, and I listened to the Colonial Assembly emergency channel, and I counted the dead as the count climbed. Heron's Drift reported 2,141,008 dead over the following 4 days. The Shoal of Calmette reported 3,019,4 and 441. Outer Pelham Station reported 706,223. The Tillich Reserves reported 2,280,330. The total at the 11-day mark, when the pathogen's viability window closed and the active count stopped rising, was 9,147 over 2. That figure was confirmed and published by the Colonial Assembly Medical Commission on the 14th day after the release. It has not been revised since. 9,147,002. I know that number the way I know my own service number. I know it without effort, without reaching for it. It is simply present, like a piece of furniture in a room I have occupied for 4 years. The Kalendi Reach, in the first 48 hours after the releases, did not transmit anything at all. This was interpreted initially as a communication failure. It was then interpreted as diplomatic paralysis. And then, as the investigation teams began to reconstruct the transit records of the 17 vessels, it was interpreted correctly. On the 6th day after the release, as the count on Heron's Drift alone had already passed 1 million, the Kalendi Reach Directorate of External Relations issued a statement. The statement did not use the words responsibility acknowledgement or regret. It described the release as the execution of a long-standing strategic security protocol in response to perceived colonial encroachment pressures. It expressed hope for continued dialogue within the framework of the Compact of Morel's Hand. The statement was received at 0614 hours at the Colonial Assembly headquarters in Geneva. At 0619 hours, the Secretary General of the Colonial Assembly transmitted a single encrypted packet to the Kalendi Reach Directorate of External Relations. The packet consisted of 3 sentences. The first sentence was the formal notification of the voiding of the Compact of Morel's Hand, all amendments and provisions included, effective at the time of transmission. The second sentence was the formal notification of the termination of the humanitarian transit corridor known as the Ardenne Gap with immediate effect. The third sentence was the formal notification that the Colonial Assembly had voted, unanimously and without abstention, to authorize a total military response against the Kalendi Reach with no defined termination date and no conditions for cessation other than the complete elimination of every Kalendi Reach military, governmental, and infrastructure installation in existence. The third sentence was 9 words long. I have it memorized, though it was not addressed to me. The settled accounts formation will depart in 72 hours. I was still on Heron's Drift when the response was authorized. I had been transported from the forward operating base to the colony's main medical facility, where I was evaluated for secondary exposure and held for observation for 3 days before being cleared. On the second day of my observation period, I asked the attending physician whether she had heard about the Colonial Assembly vote. She said she had. I asked whether she thought 72 hours was fast. She said she thought it was appropriate. I agreed with her, and then she left because she had other people to attend to. I was discharged on the 4th day. I had nowhere specific to go. The survey detachment no longer existed, and I was technically on medical leave pending a reassignment determination. I went back to the forward operating base by myself, and I sat in the operations module for approximately 6 hours. Mossad's mineral samples were still on her shelf. Someone had covered the workstations with cloth sheeting, which I suppose was a practical measure. The evidence teams had already been through, and there were procedures for the handling of the space pending a final clearance determination. But the cloth did not change the shape of the chairs or the arrangement of the desks or the specific quality of the afternoon light that came through the base's east-facing windows at that hour. I sat in the operations module and I thought about the door. I thought about the fact that Erin Mossad had been at her workstation at 1109 hours when the emergency broadcast came in. I thought about what she had done in the interval between then and whenever it was that she had put her forehead down on the console for the last time. Whether she had been trying to contact anyone, whether she had known there was nothing to do. The system's log showed the emergency broadcast received, acknowledged, and rebroadcast on local channels. Beyond that, the log showed normal operational activity until 1348 hours and then nothing. She had kept working for 2 hours and 39 minutes after the warning. I have thought about that interval more than I have thought about almost anything else in the 4 years since. I have not arrived at any particular conclusion about it. I include it here because I was asked to include everything relevant, and it is relevant to me. On the 12th day after the release, I received a communication from the Office of Admiral Commissar Yeva Storn, commanding officer of the Settled Accounts Formation. The communication was addressed personally to Corporal Rhett Davenhesh, 3rd Outer Perimeter Survey Element, Heron's Drift Detachment. It informed me that the formation was aware of my status as the sole survivor of my detachment and the only identified individual to have been present on one of the 4 target worlds during the release, and survived with full faculties intact. It noted that my survey training and my familiarity with the outer perimeter terrain conditions made me a potentially valuable asset to the ground assessment teams that would be operating on Kalendi Reach territory throughout the response operation. It asked whether I was willing to serve in that capacity on a civilian contractor basis, noting that this was entirely voluntary and that I was under no obligation to participate. I replied within the hour, I was willing. I want to be precise about my reasons, because people have asked, and I want the record to reflect the truth rather than a version of it that is easier to say. I did not agree to attach myself to the ground teams because I wanted to see destruction. I am not a person who finds satisfaction in the spectacle of ruin. I agreed because I had been on Heron's Drift, and I had come back to that operations module, and I had sat with 12 empty chairs for 6 hours, and I needed to be present for the answer in the same way I had been present for the question. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. It was not vengeance. It was something more like witness. I had seen the beginning. I needed to see the end. I departed Heron's Drift on a Colonial Assembly transport 9 days later and was shuttled to the formation assembly point at the Kessler Deep Yards. The yards were operating at a state of activity I had not previously seen in my 11 years of colonial service. The Settled Accounts Formation was being assembled with the kind of comprehensive, unhurried speed that comes from a decision made without reservation, not haste, not frenzy, but the total and organized mobilization of a force that had been built for exactly this kind of answer, and was now being told that the answer was required. I had seen fleet deployments before. I had seen the colonial defense corridors marshaling for scheduled exercises and the escort formations that ran the outer supply routes. I had never seen anything assembled at this scale, and I will not pretend that the scale was not part of what it was doing. It was intended to be seen. It was intended to communicate at a distance that the Kalendi Reach could measure from their observation posts, that what was coming was not a punitive strike or a targeted retaliation. It was an accounting. The name was deliberate. Settled accounts have no remainder, no balance carried forward, no open ledger. When accounts are settled, they are closed. The Settled Accounts Formation consisted of 714 warships organized into 9 carrier groups. The carrier groups were named by number, 1st through 9th, with no additional designations, because the people who named them had decided that the work they were going to do did not require decoration. Each group was built around a heavy carrier of the Resolute class, with attached destroyer screens, frigate lines, and orbital bombardment platforms. The frigate lines were the precision instruments. Each frigate carried targeting systems that could distinguish between a military logistics depot and an adjacent civilian grain processing facility to a tolerance of 11 meters, and their crews had trained to that standard for years, because that standard was always going to be needed eventually, and we are a civilization that builds its instruments before it needs to use them, and then hopes the instruments remain unnecessary. They had not remained unnecessary. The frigate crews deployed them now with the steady, absorbed attention of professionals using a tool they had maintained carefully, and were finally being asked to use for its intended purpose. There were additionally 41 independent logistics vessels, 27 medical ships, and 14 dedicated assessment transports, the ones that carried the ground teams, of which I was a member. We departed the Kessler Deep Yards on the 78th hour after the Secretary General's transmission, 6 hours behind the original estimate, because the commissioning paperwork for the assessment transports had encountered a documentation delay that Admiral Commissar Storn addressed in terms that I was told about secondhand and will not reproduce here, except to note that the paperwork was resolved within 2 hours and the documentation delay did not recur. I spent the transit in my assigned bunk with the reference materials for Kalendi Reach terrain and atmospheric conditions, studying the survey data that my element and others had compiled over years of outer ring work. I had been to the edge of Kalendi's space twice in my survey career, mapping the perimeter buffers. I knew their outer worlds the way a technician knows the back panels of a machine he has worked around without ever opening. I was going to open them now. The first world we reached was Kalendi Station Outer Harmath, a deep space relay and resupply installation, not technically a habitable world, but a structure large enough to support a permanent garrison of approximately 12,000 Kalendi military and technical personnel. It occupied a fixed point at the far edge of the Kalendi Reach's territorial claim, and it was, by the formation's operational plan, the first entry in the account. The assessment teams were not deployed at Outer Harmath. It was a military installation with no civilian population and no infrastructure of the kind we were there to document. The third carrier group brought it to zero operational status in 11 hours. I watched the process from the assessment transport's observation deck, a long, lit window above the cargo tier that afforded a view of the installation against the pale orange background of the Harmath debris belt. The third group's platforms are extraordinarily precise instruments. The installation was dismantled in sequence. Communications array first, then propulsion and power infrastructure, then the garrison sectors, then the hull. The debris field that remained was surveyed by a colonial defense engineering team to ensure no structural element of military utility remained. Then we moved on. I kept a private log throughout the operation. I was not required to keep one. My official role was terrain assessment, and there were dedicated record keepers embedded in every ground team. But I kept one because I have always been a person who processes experience through written description, and because I had already begun composing in my mind what I knew I would eventually be asked to write. The private log gave me a place to put the observations that were mine specifically, as distinct from the official assessment record. The first entry in my private log, written during the transit away from Outer Harmath, reads as follows. The third group took 11 hours. The station existed for approximately 40 years, according to the reference data. Kalendi installations are well built. The engineering teams are thorough. I ate dinner in the assessment team's mess. The food was adequate. I slept 6 hours. I do not think this is particularly illuminating prose. I was not writing literature. I was keeping track of the hours and the facts because I had a great need during this period to keep a very firm grip on the sequence of things, to know where I was in the account and how much remained. The second entry covers the transit to the Kalendi Reach's first inhabited world, which in their administrative taxonomy was designated Reach Interior 4, but which had a Kalendi name that translated roughly into the secondary home. The assessment teams were deployed here. I was part of a 6-person team assigned to the Eastern Continent's agricultural and industrial corridor. The Kalendi evacuated their worlds ahead of the formation. I should note this clearly, because it would be inaccurate to suggest otherwise. The formation transmitted a specific notification to each Kalendi Reach inhabited world 72 hours before the carrier group assigned to that world arrived in system. The notification stated that the world's military, governmental, and infrastructure installations would be removed, that civilian populations were advised to move away from those installations and toward open terrain, and that civilian populations who remained in open terrain would not be targeted. This was the instruction I received when I was attached to the formation. Civilian populations in open terrain were not targets. The account was with the Kalendi Reach's capacity for the kind of governance that had produced Protocol Ardenne. That capacity had to be fully and finally eliminated. The people were separate. Many of the people went. Some did not. This is the truth of it, and I will not soften it. There were Kalendi on the surface of Reach Interior 4 when the carrier groups worked, and so some of them were in proximity to infrastructure installations when those installations were addressed. The formation's precision was genuine. The civilian deaths at Reach Interior 4 were, according to the official assessment which I contributed to, several hundred. I know what the Kalendi Reach's own figure would have been from the other direction. I know it was 9,147,002. I hold both numbers, and I do not pretend they are equivalent. And I do not pretend that the several hundred at Reach Interior 4 are simply acceptable. They are part of the cost. The cost is not clean. I have never said it was clean. I am saying what happened. My ground team assessed the Eastern Corridor. Kalendi agricultural infrastructure is extensive and in places genuinely impressive by engineering standards. Their soil conditioning systems are deep-rooted, mechanical, and built to last. The irrigation architecture on the Eastern Corridor runs for several hundred kilometers of largely buried conduit, engineered for durability over centuries rather than decades. And in the survey context, it is the kind of construction that you cannot help but regard with a certain professional respect. None of that is what we were there to assess. We were assessing the military logistics depots that were embedded in the agricultural corridor, 7 of them, spaced along the corridor's main transport artery, in a pattern that the Kalendi clearly intended to make them difficult to distinguish from civilian supply facilities. They were not, in the end, difficult to distinguish. The engineering team's scans were very good. The depots were addressed. I walked the terrain between 2 of the depot sites after the assessment, while the engineering teams completed their verification sweeps. The Kalendi landscape on this world was amber-colored, a deep, warm amber that came from the soil composition and the particular wavelength of the local star's light through the atmosphere. The sky was pale yellow-green. The vegetation was low-growing, dense, with a texture like tightly packed steel wool when you touched it, though I am told it is soft to Kalendi sensory organs. Everything smelled faintly of mineral and something sweet, which the reference materials identified as a native ground-level pollinator that releases a chemical attractant as a byproduct of its activity cycle. I do not know why I include this. I suppose because I was there and the place existed, and I have an obligation to acknowledge that it was a real place with a real character, and not simply a coordinate in an operational plan. The ground team leader, a colonial defense captain named Haas, asked me what I was writing in my log when he saw me stopping to note the vegetation texture. I told him I was keeping a terrain record. He accepted this without further inquiry. The formation moved through the Kalendi Reach system by system over 44 days. 9 worlds, 14 stations, 23 military depots, 7 shipyard facilities, 2 deep space research installations, the Kalendi Reach Fleet Command Headquarters, which occupied its own fortified platform in the space between Reach Interior 2 and 3, and the administrative capital, which was on Reach Interior 1. The administrative capital was last. I will describe some of what came between, because it is relevant to understanding what the 44 days were. On the 5th day, we reached Reach Interior 2, a world more heavily developed than Interior 4, closer to the core of Kalendi's civilization, with a larger permanent population and a correspondingly larger infrastructure footprint. My team was assigned to the Northern Continent's communications and relay infrastructure, which was concentrated along a coastal ridge system that the reference data described as the Kalendi equivalent of a primary communications backbone. The ridge was beautiful in the way that purely functional things are sometimes beautiful, long and bare and swept by a steady wind off the coast, with the relay towers spaced at intervals along its spine, their support structures describing a regular geometric rhythm against the pale yellow sky that you could follow with your eye all the way to the horizon. The Kalendi who had not evacuated were visible in the valley settlements below the ridge. We could see them from our position, small figures moving between structures, moving away from the ridgeline as we worked, not in panic, but in the deliberate way of people who have been told clearly what is coming and have decided where they need to be when it arrives. We did not interfere with their movement. We were there for the relay infrastructure. My team documented the site geometry, confirmed the targeting reference points, and flagged 2 structures that the reference data had categorized as military relay nodes, but that our on-site assessment determined were mixed use. 1 tower serving both military communications and civilian emergency broadcast functions. The targeting data was updated accordingly. The carrier group's platforms addressed the military relay nodes. The civilian emergency broadcast tower was left intact. I noted this in my private log as well because it seemed important to note the targeting data was updated because a surveyor walked the ridge and looked at the actual configuration of the towers and determined that the reference data was insufficiently precise. This is what ground assessment teams are for. This is why the formation brought 14 assessment transports and deployed them world by world rather than working from orbital data alone. The account was with the Kalendi Reach's military and governmental infrastructure. A civilian emergency broadcast tower was not an entry in that account. We did not make it one. On the 9th day, the assessment teams were deployed to Kalendi Reach's primary shipyard facility. which was a 14-kilometer installation at the L2 point of Reach Interior 3. I had studied the survey data on this installation extensively. It was old by Kalendi standards, approximately 90 years, and had been continuously expanded and upgraded throughout its operational life. It was, at the time of our arrival, still partly operational, which had not been anticipated by the deployment schedule. 4 Kalendi Reach warships were in various stages of construction, and a fifth, a heavy cruiser by class designation, approximately 80% complete, had apparently been crewed and was attempting to depart the installation as the 4th carrier group came into range. The heavy cruiser did not depart the installation. It was stopped by the 4th group's lead destroyer screen in a brief engagement that lasted 11 minutes. The cruiser's crew was offered the opportunity to abandon ship before the engagement concluded. The offer was transmitted on open channel in both Colonial Standard and the Kalendi administrative dialect. The Kalendi crew did not respond on any channel. Whether this was a refusal or a communications failure, I cannot determine. The engagement was completed. The cruiser was destroyed and the installation was then addressed in full. I was not on the surface for this one. I was in the assessment transport, monitoring the ground team's feeds from the docking platforms on the installation's secondary arm. What I remember most clearly from the feeds was the scale of the unfinished warship hulls in their construction bays, the skeletal frames of ships that the Kalendi had been building presumably for the purpose of continuing to be the kind of civilization that executes Protocol Ardenne against its neighbors. The frames were stripped by the engineering teams at the same methodical pace as everything else. It took longer than I expected. The installation had been well built, and well-built things take longer to take apart. On the 19th day, the Kalendi Reach transmitted a proposal for negotiation. The proposal was directed to the Colonial Assembly through a third-party relay, a minor, unaligned species called the Vernathi, who occupied a single system at the edge of the contested perimeter, and had apparently been asked to serve as intermediaries. The proposal offered full disclosure of the Protocol Ardenne development program, full restitution payments, and the permanent dismantlement of the Kalendi Reach military command structure in exchange for cessation of the Settled Accounts Formation's operations. The Colonial Assembly received the proposal at 0314 hours. The response was transmitted at 0317 hours. The response was 2 sentences. The first sentence acknowledged receipt of the transmission. The second sentence stated that the Settled Accounts Formation would continue its operations until completion. The Vernathi intermediary transmitted a follow-up request for clarification of the conditions under which a cessation offer would be considered. The Colonial Assembly did not respond to the follow-up. I read about this exchange in the operational briefings the following morning, over breakfast. I wrote in my private log, "They are still calculating. They believe there is a number that will stop this. There is no such number. The account does not work that way." I then finished my breakfast and attended the terrain briefing for Reach Interior 2. The Kalendi Reach issued a second proposal on the 27th day, directed this time not to the Colonial Assembly but to the individual member, species of the Assembly Security Council, apparently on the theory that there might be variation in resolve among them that could be exploited. There was not. Each council member transmitted the same response independently within hours of each other, having apparently not coordinated their replies. The Settled Accounts Formation would continue. I mention the second proposal because it interests me as an indicator of how the Kalendi Reach continued to model human decision-making even at this late stage. They believed, right up until very near the end, that we were operating within a cost-benefit framework that could be adjusted if the right offer were made. That there was a point at which we would calculate that what we were spending outweighed what we were gaining, and we would stop. This is a perfectly reasonable way to model an adversary who is responding to a military threat with a military counter-threat, because that kind of response is calibrated to achieve a specific end state. And when that end state is achieved, or when the cost becomes prohibitive, the response ceases. It is an entirely unreasonable way to model what the Settled Accounts Formation was. The formation was not calibrated to achieve an end state that could be negotiated. It was calibrated to complete an account. The account was specific. It did not have a negotiating range. The Kalendi Reach had spent 11 years engineering a biological weapon designed for human lung tissue, had used a humanitarian corridor we left open in good faith to deliver that weapon to 4 of our worlds, and had killed 947,002 people in 11 days. The account that was opened on that day was specific to the amount of 9,147,002 lives. The destruction of the infrastructure that had enabled and planned and executed that killing and the permanent elimination of the governing apparatus that had authorized it. The Kalendi Reach could not offer us anything that would change those entries. The math was already written. They would have understood this, I think, if they had spent 11 years studying us, the way they had spent 11 years building a weapon for us. But they had been studying us as a military and diplomatic actor, which is the natural focus for a civilization planning a covert attack. They had not apparently been studying us as a civilization capable of arriving at a certain kind of moral clarity, the kind that does not recalculate, the kind that simply continues. I have thought about this aspect of the operation more than most people seem to want to discuss it. The common observation in the years since is that the settled accounts formation was a demonstration of power, that its purpose was to communicate a message to every other civilization in contact with the colonial assembly, and that the message was the scale of the response and the completeness of it. This is not wrong, but I think it is incomplete. The formation was not primarily a demonstration, it was primarily a completion. The demonstration was incidental to the completion, a consequence of it rather than its purpose. We did not send 714 warships to send a message. We sent 714 warships because the account required 714 warships to close. The message received by every other civilization was accurate, precisely because it was not constructed for their benefit. It was the byproduct of an internal logic that had nothing to do with how it appeared from outside. I think this is what the Kalendi Reach fundamentally failed to model. They modeled us as strategic communicators, which is what they were. Every action the Kalendi Reach took, from the corridor conditioning to the execution of Protocol Ardenne to the first and second negotiation proposals, was calibrated for a strategic communication purpose, designed to be read by an audience and to produce a response from that audience. They could not conceive of an actor that was not, at its core, performing for an audience. When we responded with 714 warships, they read it as a very large performance, and they tried to find a counter-performance that would change what we were communicating. There was no counter-performance. We were not communicating. We were completing. On the 31st day, the Fleet Command Headquarters was addressed. I will say very little about this, except that it took the longest of any single installation, 3 full days of continuous work by the 2nd and 5th carrier groups, because the Kalendi Reach had built their Fleet Command in the deliberate belief that no one would ever be able to dismantle it. It was multiply redundant, hardened against every class of weapon the Kalendi knew about, and designed to remain operationally viable even under sustained assault. This design philosophy had an obvious flaw, which is that it was predicated on the kinds of assault that a potential adversary operating in a cost-benefit framework might be willing to sustain, rather than the kind that an entity completing an account would sustain regardless of cost. The 2nd and 5th groups sustained their work for 3 days without interruption. The headquarters was addressed in full by 2,200 hours on the 34th day. By the 35th day, the Kalendi Reach administrative capital was the last significant installation that remained. Everything else, the outer stations, the inhabited worlds, the shipyards, the research platforms, the fleet command, the military depots had been addressed. The Kalendi Reach, as a functional political and military entity, had at this point ceased to exist. What remained on Reach Interior 1 was their governmental apparatus, housed in a complex that occupied the central continent's administrative plateau, a place called, in Kalendi, something that translated into the first seat, and whatever population remained in the surrounding civilian settlements. The formation had given 72 hours notice to Reach Interior 1, as to all the other worlds. A significant portion of the civilian population had dispersed into the open terrain of the continent's eastern watershed, which our survey data indicated was largely undeveloped and well away from the administrative complex. They would not be targeted there. The administrative complex would be addressed. I was part of the ground assessment team deployed to Reach Interior 1. We were among the first non-Kalendi to set foot on the administrative capital, since the Compact of Morale's Hand had last convened a joint technical session there 4 years before Protocol Ardenne. The shuttle brought us down through a pale yellow atmosphere into daylight over the administrative plateau. The plateau was wide and flat, and covered in the amber-colored low vegetation I had first encountered on Reach Interior 4. The administrative complex was visible from a considerable distance, a cluster of tall, angular structures that caught the local stars' light on their upper surfaces and threw long shadows eastward across the plateau. We landed on the complex's main approach apron. The Kalendi had cleared the apron, or rather they had not chosen to mount any kind of resistance at it, which amounts to the same thing from a practical standpoint. There were Kalendi ground vehicles parked in orderly rows along one side of the apron, administrative transport, by their design. And the impression was of a place whose daily operations had simply paused, rather than a place that understood itself to be ending. I do not know what they thought would happen. I think they had stopped knowing what to think. My team's initial task was terrain verification, confirming that the site mapping in our reference data matched the actual layout of the complex, so that the carrier group's targeting data would be accurate. It was methodical survey work, not very different from what I had been doing on Heron's Drift when Protocol Ardenne was executed. I walked the approaches to the main administrative building, measuring sight lines and checking structural reference points against the survey database, and I noted discrepancies in a standard assessment log. The building itself was large and built in the Kalendi administrative style, angular, vertically ambitious, surfaced in a pale material that their reference designation listed as compacted mineral aggregate with a silicate finish, which caught the morning light on its upper faces and held it with an almost luminous quality, so that the top third of the building appeared to be lit from within, even though it was simply reflecting the daylight. It was, by any straightforward evaluation, a handsome structure. I noted this in the assessment log and moved on. At 11:30 hours local, a Kalendi official emerged from the main administrative building and walked toward our team. He was escorted by two other Kalendi, unarmed by any standard our scanners could detect. He wore what the reference data indicated was formal administrative attire, a layered garment in a deep blue-green that was apparently the color associated with executive governmental function in Kalendi visual protocol. He was tall by Kalendi standards. He moved carefully, placing his feet with deliberate steadiness, in the way that beings move when they are managing something internal. He addressed our team leader, Captain Haas, in colonial standard, which was fluent and unaccented. He said his name and his title, which designated him as the senior-most surviving member of the Kalendi Reach, Directorate of External Relations. He said that the Directorate wished to transmit a formal statement of record to the Colonial Assembly and to Admiral Commissar Storn, and that he was asking for a communications relay to be provided for this purpose. Captain Haas asked me, without turning to look at me, whether I had any recommendation on the request. I was the survey attaché and not a military officer, and he was not required to consult me, but he had developed a habit over the preceding weeks of asking my view on things that were adjacent to my particular reason for being there. I said that the Colonial Assembly's position on transmissions from the Kalendi Reach had been stated consistently. Haas acknowledged this. Then he turned back to the official and told him in clear and careful colonial standard that the team had no authority to facilitate a transmission from the Kalendi Reach Directorate to any Colonial Assembly entity, that this was consistent with the Colonial Assembly's stated position, and that the team's purpose on the surface was terrain assessment. The official stood for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in the same careful colonial standard, that he understood and thanked us for the clarity. He and his escorts returned to the building. The carrier groups completed the assessment of the administrative complex beginning at 1400 hours local and concluding at 00030 hours the following morning. The precision was, again, the thing that struck me most, not the scale, which was expected, but the precision. The complex was vast and its structures were deeply interconnected, and the targeting sequence required continuous adjustment as each structure's actual response to the preceding work became clear. The engineering teams coordinating the targeting were extraordinarily skilled. By the time the work concluded, the administrative plateau was flat in the way that plateaus are flat when nothing has ever been built on them. I was back in the assessment transport for the completion of the work, watching the feeds from our ground monitoring equipment. I wrote in my private log, the first seat is flat now. The amber vegetation will grow back over it in time. Eventually, I am told, the local ecology recovers from most kinds of disturbance. I believe this. I have been a surveyor long enough to know that terrain remembers its own shape. The formation departed Kalendi space on the 44th day. I was on the assessment transport for the transit back, and for most of it I read the terrain reports I had accumulated over the operation and began composing them into the formal assessment record that was part of my contracted deliverable. The reports were accurate and complete. They described the geological and ecological characteristics of the sites assessed, the discrepancies between reference data and actual conditions, and the post-assessment state of each site. They were survey documents. That is what they were meant to be. I submitted the formal assessment record on the 51st day after departure, and I began this account on the 52nd day because by then the people who had asked me to write it had reminded me twice. and I had been unable to produce a satisfying explanation for the delay. The honest explanation is that I was not certain, until recently, that I had anything to add to the official record that was not already in it. I am more certain now. I think there is one thing I can add that is mine specifically, and that belongs in the record because it happened and because I was there. On the last morning on Reach Interior 1, the morning after the work on the administrative complex concluded, before the transport's departure window, I went back to the plateau. I went alone with a surveyor's kit because that is what you carry when you go to a site. I walked the edge of the cleared area for about an hour. The amber vegetation was dusty and pressed flat near the work zone's perimeter, but intact and upright a few hundred meters out, and the morning air had the mineral smell overlaid with the faint sweet pollinator scent I had noticed on Reach Interior 4. It smelled like the planet. It smelled like the planet was continuing, which it was. I took some core samples from the plateau's eastern margin, because I was a surveyor and I had the kit and the habit. I logged them. The basalt under the plateau's surface soil is similar in composition to what I had been sampling on Heron's Drift on the day Protocol Ardenne was executed. Not identical, but similar. Rock is rock in certain deep ways, regardless of what star it formed under. I stood at the edge of the cleared plateau for a while and looked at where the administrative complex had been, and I thought about the door again. The door I had latched from the inside at 0340 hours on a morning 4 years earlier because I needed to prevent sample contamination. The door the Kalendi Reach had spent 11 years persuading us to leave open. The door that Aaron Mossad had been on the other side of, at her workstation for 2 hours and 39 minutes after the warning came in, still working, still transmitting the rebroadcast, still doing the next thing and the next thing, because that is what you do when there is no other thing to do. I thought about all of those doors, the literal one and the others. The Ardenne Gap, which was a door we left open for them. The compact of Muriel's hand, which was a door we built together and thought we were both standing in the frame of. The 72-hour notification we gave each of their worlds, which was a door we left open for their civilian populations even as we came through everything else. The offer we transmitted on open channel to the crew of that heavy cruiser in the shipyard, the offer they did not answer, which was a door we left open even then, even there, until 11 minutes had passed and the account required closing it. I thought about the transmission the official had tried to arrange, and I thought about what it might have said, and I thought about the fact that we had not received it. We had not received it because there was nothing in it that changed the entries in the account. Whatever it said, apology, rationalization, plea, defiance, the particular formulation of words that the Kalendi Reach's senior surviving diplomat had prepared for transmission to the people who were closing his civilization's last installation. It could not change what was written. 9,147,002. The account was specific, and it was closed. There was no transmission that opened it again. I do not say this without understanding the weight of it. I am aware that a transmission not received is a form of door closed, that there is something in the refusal to hear a last statement that constitutes its own moral act, separate from the military operations, and that reasonable people can hold a view about whether that act was right. I am not going to argue the point. I was on Heron's Drift. I came back to 12 empty chairs. I spent 6 hours in that room, and I have spent 4 years in that room since. And whatever view I hold about the closed transmission, it is not a view that anyone who was not on Heron's Drift on that day is entitled to contest with me, because they are not working with the same information I am working with. The information I am working with is specific. It has a texture and a smell and a weight that is different from information encountered at a remove. I flew back to the transport. I logged my core samples and stowed my kit. I wrote the last entry in my private log before departure. The plateau is flat, 44 days. Everything that needed to be done has been done. The account is closed. That is what this was, a closed account. Not a victory, not in the sense that word is normally used. There is nothing in a closed account that resembles the conventional shape of a victory, with its relief and its pride and its return. A closed account is simply a closed account. It is the end of a ledger that should never have been opened. It is the final state of a door that someone opened without our knowledge and used to bring something through that killed 9 million people in 11 days. We do not leave doors open anymore. The humanitarian corridor provisions of every compact and agreement we maintain have been reviewed and revised. The Ardenne Amendment has been formally stricken from the record and its removal noted in the preamble of every subsequent treaty document as a reminder of what an open door can be walked through by a party that spent 11 years building what they intended to bring. There is now a single line appended to the preamble of every humanitarian transit provision in every Colonial Assembly compact currently in force. It reads in Colonial Standard, "The Ardenne Gap is closed. It will remain closed. Let this record stand as the reason. The line is not negotiable. It does not have an amendment provision. It cannot be removed by any revision process, because the revision process that would govern it was itself revised after Protocol Ardenne to exclude the line from the scope of any future amendment. I have been asked since returning whether I think the settled accounts formation did what was right. I have answered this question the same way each time, and I will answer it the same way here, in the record, so that my answer is documented and will not be misremembered or adjusted for easier quotation. I think the settled accounts formation did what was necessary. I think necessary and right are sometimes the same word, and I think sometimes they are not, and I think the distance between them, in any specific case, is exactly as wide as the gap between what was done and what could have been avoided. And that gap is owned, in this case, entirely by the civilization that opened Protocol Ardenne and walked it through a door we were persuaded to leave unlocked. 9,147,000. Two people could not make that choice differently. The settled accounts formation did not give the Kalendi Reach the opportunity to make it differently either. That is what I witnessed. That is what I have written down. The door is closed. It will not be opened again.